Have you ever wondered why certain events unfold the way they do in your life? Why do we meet specific people at precise moments, or experience pain just when we least expect it? For many, life's randomness can be difficult to accept, especially when we find ourselves caught in the whirlwind of suffering and confusion. But what if I told you that there is a deeper reason behind every experience, even the painful ones? What if each moment, every encounter, and each struggle we face serves a purpose in the grand design of our lives? This concept isn't just philosophical, it's deeply embedded in Buddhist teachings. In today's video, we will explore the profound truth behind the idea that everything happens for a reason, and how understanding this principle can lead us to spiritual growth, resilience, and a more harmonious life. But first, let me invite you to reflect on a simple question. How many times have you faced something difficult, only to look back and realize that it taught you something valuable? Something that changed you, even if it was painful. Today, we are going to explore why those moments happen, and how embracing life's challenges with mindfulness and wisdom can transform the way we view the world. Buddhist philosophy teaches us that every event in our life, whether joyful or painful, carries a hidden purpose. This is not merely a matter of coincidence, it's a reflection of deep, universal truths about existence. Let's break down some key Buddhist concepts that help us make sense of this. 1. Impermanence, anicca, the ever-changing nature of life. The Buddhist concept of anicca, impermanence, is the fundamental understanding that everything in existence is in a state of constant change. It's one of the three core marks of existence, alongside suffering, dukkha, and non-self, anatta. This principle, which emphasizes the transient nature of all things, whether thoughts, emotions, relationships, or even the universe itself, challenges our ingrained desire for permanence and stability. In the modern world, we are conditioned to resist change. We desire comfort, security, and control, and we tend to cling to what we know, especially in the face of uncertainty. But anicca teaches us that change is not just inevitable, it's the very nature of existence. Understanding this truth can lead to profound liberation, as it allows us to accept life's inherent uncertainty and let go of our attachments. Consider the life of someone like Steve Jobs, co-founder of Apple, who experienced the unpredictable nature of life in a very public way. He was once at the peak of success, revered as one of the most powerful figures in the tech world, only to be ousted from his own company. That period of loss and failure, however, was not the end of his journey. Jobs would return to Apple years later, transforming the company into an icon of innovation and design. This change, his ousting, his return, was part of the natural ebb and flow of his life. Anicca teaches us that no situation, whether joyful or painful, lasts forever. Success and failure are both impermanent. When it comes to impermanence, the way humans psychologically respond to change is vital to understanding why we often struggle to accept it. Modern psychology reveals that our brains are wired to resist change. This resistance stems from an evolutionary survival mechanism that favors predictability and stability. The human brain, particularly the amygdala, is sensitive to unpredictability, triggering fear and stress in response to changes that threaten our sense of safety. In essence, our brains are designed to fight change, because, historically, uncertainty could signal danger. The stress response, governed by the amygdala, initiates a cascade of biological reactions, heightened heart rate, anxiety, and fear, which were useful in our evolutionary past when avoiding harm was paramount. However, in the modern world, this reaction to change can lead to distress when it's not necessary. We cling to routines and resist letting go, even when such attachments are no longer beneficial. Neuroscience shows that this resistance to change, this inability to accept anicca, can lead to chronic stress and mental health challenges, such as anxiety and depression. Our attachment to permanence isn't just a philosophical issue, it's a neurological one as well. At the heart of our struggle with impermanence lies the ego, the false self that seeks to maintain a sense of control over an ever-changing world. The ego depends on stability to sustain its identity, and when faced with change, it perceives a threat to its very existence. This is why letting go of the illusion of control is so difficult. The ego clings to what it believes is stable, whether it's a relationship, a job, or even an idea of who we are. Take, for example, the story of Barack Obama's presidency. Throughout his time in office, he experienced both adulation and criticism, facing the pressure of being in a position where constant change was inevitable, policy shifts, international crises, and the demands of governance. In his final year, Obama reflected on his presidency, acknowledging that his tenure, while historically significant, was just one chapter in a much larger unfolding story. His capacity to let go of the ego's attachment to stability and the position of power was a necessary part of the natural cycle of leadership. This is a reflection of how we, as individuals, can struggle with impermanence in our own lives. Whether it's the loss of a job, the end of a relationship, or an unexpected health crisis, the attachment to what we believe should remain stable can trigger intense emotional responses. The ego, in its fear of impermanence, often resists these inevitable changes, making the suffering we experience even more intense. From a neuroscientific perspective, accepting anicca, the understanding that everything changes, can have profound benefits on mental health. Research in neuroplasticity shows that our brains have the capacity to change and adapt in response to our experiences. This adaptability means that we can train our brains to accept uncertainty and change, just as we can train our bodies to endure physical discomfort through exercise. One study by Dr. Richard Davidson, a neuroscientist at the University of Wisconsin, shows that mindfulness practices, such as focusing on the present moment, can reshape the brain to better handle stress and change. Mindfulness encourages individuals to accept their experience as it is, rather than fighting against it. This practice has been shown to increase gray matter in areas of the brain associated with emotional regulation and self-awareness, and decrease activity in areas that trigger anxiety and fear in response to change. When we accept that change is inevitable and that anicca is not an anomaly but a natural law, our brains can rewire themselves to not only tolerate but even thrive in the face of impermanence. The more we accept change rather than resist it, the more we strengthen the brain's ability to adapt, reducing the negative emotional reactions that stem from fear of loss. Understanding impermanence is not just a philosophical concept, it's a practical tool for navigating life's challenges. Many of the world's most successful individuals, those who have experienced great triumphs and deep losses, have learned to embrace anicca. Elon Musk, for example, has faced numerous setbacks throughout his career. From early failures in space exploration to near bankruptcy at Tesla, Musk's story is one of constant adaptation and resilience. His success isn't just the result of innovation, it's also the result of his ability to adapt to the ever-changing nature of technology and business, without being crushed by the fear of failure or loss. Impermanence, when viewed through the lens of Buddhist philosophy, allows us to develop a greater sense of equanimity. By letting go of attachments to outcomes, we free ourselves from the anxiety that comes from trying to control the uncontrollable. We can still set goals, take action, and strive for success, but we do so with the understanding that the world is fluid and nothing is guaranteed. The true freedom comes from letting go of our attachment to permanence and learning to embrace the flow of life as it unfolds. When we are able to accept that everything is temporary, we can appreciate the present moment more deeply, knowing that it, too, will change. This perspective allows us to fully experience joy without clinging to it, and to face adversity without being crushed by it. In the modern world, anicca offers a powerful antidote to the stress and dissatisfaction that arises from our attachment to stability. By understanding that life is inherently transient, and by embracing the change that comes with this reality, we can better navigate the complexities of the world around us. This understanding, supported by both Buddhist philosophy and modern neuroscience, teaches us that acceptance is not passivity, but a conscious choice to live in harmony with the ever-changing nature of existence. It's only through this acceptance that we can begin to live with greater peace, resilience, and a deeper sense of purpose. 2. Karma, the law of cause and effect. The concept of karma, a fundamental teaching in Buddhism, is rooted in the law of cause and effect. Simply put, it states that every action we take, whether physical, verbal, or mental, generates a corresponding result. This law of cause and effect governs not only individual lives but also the interconnected web of existence. What we do today, whether consciously or unconsciously, will shape our future. While the idea of karma is often misunderstood in popular culture as a form of cosmic retribution or punishment, it's much more nuanced. In Buddhist philosophy, karma is neither punitive nor rewarding in the traditional sense. Instead, it is a natural law, much like gravity. It is not the universe paying you back for your actions, but rather the inherent consequences of those actions unfolding over time. The results of our actions may not always be immediate, but they are inevitable. This understanding of karma can significantly reshape how we view the challenges and joys of life. In modern times, karma is often associated with ideas of good and bad actions being paid back. For instance, the famous adage, "What goes around comes around," seems to imply a direct balancing of scales. Good deeds lead to good outcomes, while bad deeds lead to misfortune. However, this simplified view misses the deeper, more intricate workings of karma. At its core, karma is not about cosmic retribution. It's about cause and effect, a natural unfolding of actions and their consequences. The Buddha likened karma to planting a seed. You may plant a seed of kindness, and over time, that seed will grow into a tree of positive outcomes. On the other hand, if you plant seeds of hatred or anger, the tree that grows will bear fruits of suffering and negativity. However, the Buddha also emphasized that karma is not a static process, it is dynamic and malleable. It can be influenced, altered, and even mitigated by awareness and intention. For example, the Dalai Lama, a figure who embodies compassion and kindness, has often spoken about the power of intention in shaping one's karma. He suggests that karma is not solely about the actions themselves but about the mental states behind them. A small act of kindness, performed with a pure heart and good intentions, can generate immense positive results, whereas an action, even if outwardly virtuous, performed with selfish intentions might not lead to the desired outcome. Let's take the example of Nelson Mandela, a man who endured 27 years of imprisonment and emerged not with hatred but with a powerful commitment to reconciliation. His own life exemplified karma in action, showing that even in the face of immense adversity, choosing to act with compassion and forgiveness can transform not only one's personal fate but also the future of an entire nation. Mandela's actions were the seeds of reconciliation that grew into a peaceful, democratic South Africa. Neuroscience offers a fascinating perspective on karma, especially when we consider how our actions and thoughts influence our brains. The concept of karma aligns closely with what modern psychologists call self-regulation and personal responsibility. Our actions are not isolated, they ripple through the interconnected networks of our relationships, our communities, and even our minds. Research in neuroscience reveals that our thoughts and actions shape neural pathways in our brains. For instance, when we act out of compassion or kindness, our brain releases chemicals like oxytocin, dopamine, and serotonin, neurotransmitters associated with feelings of happiness and well-being. These feel-good chemicals not only enhance our mood in the moment but can have long-term positive effects on our mental and physical health. In contrast, when we act out of anger or greed, our brain triggers stress responses, activating the amygdala, the part of the brain responsible for the fight or flight response. This leads to an increase in cortisol, the stress hormone, which can have detrimental effects on our body and mind over time. Thus, our actions, whether driven by positive or negative emotions, actually shape our brains and influence the course of our lives. The neuroplasticity of the brain means that our actions and intentions, whether positive or negative, create lasting impressions. If we cultivate negative emotions like anger, resentment, or jealousy, we reinforce neural pathways that make it easier to experience those emotions in the future. On the other hand, cultivating positive emotions such as gratitude, joy, and compassion strengthens the neural circuits that promote well-being and resilience. This is where karma aligns with modern neuroscience, our actions and thoughts shape our reality in both tangible and subtle ways. One of the key elements of karma that is often overlooked is the role of intention. In Buddhism, intention is seen as the seed of karma. A seemingly innocuous action, like helping a friend with a task, can have a vastly different impact depending on the intention behind it. If you help someone because you genuinely care about their well-being, the result will be vastly different than if you help them with the expectation of something in return. The Buddha emphasized that intention is the forerunner of action. In this light, karma is not just about what we do, but why we do it. Our intentions shape the nature of the karma we create. A good action performed with a selfish intention is not good in the truest sense. Similarly, an action that may seem negative on the surface, such as confronting a person about their harmful behavior, may lead to positive outcomes if done with the intention of promoting truth and healing. Take, for example, the case of Oprah Winfrey, a person who has used her platform not just for personal gain but to advocate for important social issues. Winfrey's success is not solely the result of her actions but of the intention behind those actions, her drive to uplift others and spread positivity. This intention has allowed her to create a vast network of influence that has brought healing to millions. Her karma, therefore, reflects the power of intention in shaping the world around her. One of the most profound ways karma manifests is in our relationships with others. Every interaction we have, no matter how small, sends out ripples into the world. We are constantly creating and influencing karma, not just for ourselves but for those around us. These ripples can manifest in subtle ways: a smile, a kind word, a moment of understanding. Conversely, negative actions can also affect others, often in ways we don't immediately see. Research in psychology confirms the impact that our behavior has on others. Studies show that kindness is contagious. When we do something good for someone else, they are more likely to pay it forward. This is a form of karma in action. The seeds we plant in others' hearts often grow beyond our expectations. This is how positive karma creates an interconnected world of compassion and support. Conversely, negative karma can propagate itself in much the same way. If we engage in harmful actions, they often cause harm to those around us. The negative karma we create through unkind words or actions can ripple outward, affecting people and situations in ways we might not immediately understand. This is why, in Buddhist teachings, one is encouraged to develop mindfulness, not just of our own actions but of their effects on others. Karma is not just an abstract Buddhist concept, it is a dynamic, practical law that governs every aspect of our lives. By understanding the intricacies of karma, we are not only able to make more conscious choices, but we are also empowered to break free from destructive cycles and create a more compassionate and mindful world. By focusing on the intention behind our actions, we can align our lives with the natural laws of cause and effect, creating positive ripples in our own lives and in the lives of others. Neuroscience, psychology, and Buddhist philosophy all agree that our actions, thoughts, and intentions shape the world around us. The more we embrace this understanding, the more we can harness the power of karma to create a life filled with purpose, peace, and positive transformation. 3. The root of suffering. In Buddhist philosophy, attachment, or upadana in Sanskrit, is considered one of the primary causes of human suffering. At its core, attachment refers to the emotional clinging we have to things, people, or even ideas. This deep attachment is not just about holding on to material possessions, but about the way we identify with the impermanent world around us, mistakenly believing that it can provide us with lasting happiness or security. The Buddha taught that the root of suffering does not lie in external events but in our relationship with those events, specifically how we attach ourselves to them. This concept may seem simple at first, but its implications are profound. Attachment creates a cycle of craving, dissatisfaction, and endless yearning. When we become attached to something, whether it is a person, a possession, or a particular outcome, we become dependent on that thing for our happiness. The paradox, however, is that the more we attach, the more we suffer. To understand the nature of attachment, we must first examine the delusion of permanence that underpins it. Human beings tend to cling to things because we want them to last forever. We desire stability, predictability, and a sense of control over our environment. Whether it's a romantic relationship, a career, or even a belief system, we often want these things to provide us with permanent satisfaction. However, as Buddhism teaches, all things are impermanent, anicca, including our attachments. Nothing in the universe, not even our own thoughts and emotions, remains the same. The Buddha compared attachment to grasping at a burning ember. We may hold it, but in doing so, we will inevitably be burned. The more we cling to things, the more we entangle ourselves in suffering. Consider the case of Steve Jobs, the co-founder of Apple. Jobs' extraordinary success made him one of the most influential figures in the modern world. However, in his personal life, Jobs struggled with attachment, both to his vision of perfection and to his relationships. For years, he was estranged from his biological daughter, Lisa, and even his family life seemed tumultuous. In his final years, after being diagnosed with cancer, Jobs famously reflected on how his attachment to fame, wealth, and success had not brought him true happiness. He admitted that in the end, death is the destination we all share. No one has ever escaped it. Jobs' personal story encapsulates how attachment to worldly success and permanence ultimately leads to dissatisfaction and regret. Modern psychology also provides valuable insights into the nature of attachment. In the field of attachment theory, psychologists such as John Bowlby and Mary Ainsworth have shown that our early relationships, particularly with caregivers, shape the way we form attachments throughout our lives. These early bonds, whether healthy or unhealthy, create patterns of attachment that affect how we relate to people, possessions, and even ourselves. In the context of romantic relationships, attachment theory suggests that people who have insecure attachment styles may cling to their partners due to fear of abandonment or a deep need for validation. This form of attachment can lead to codependency, jealousy, and emotional instability. Much like the Buddhist teaching, modern psychology emphasizes that attachment, when based on insecurity or fear, ultimately leads to suffering. The more we cling to a partner or the approval of others, the more we expose ourselves to emotional pain. From a neurological standpoint, research shows that attachment is deeply ingrained in our brain's wiring. The hormone oxytocin, often referred to as the bonding hormone, plays a central role in forming attachments. While oxytocin is essential for creating healthy connections, it can also exacerbate unhealthy attachments if misused. For instance, when we form attachment to an unhealthy relationship or an object of desire, our brain continues to seek out that pleasurable bond, even when it may cause harm. This cycle can be likened to addiction, where the brain craves more of what provides temporary pleasure, even at the cost of long-term well-being. One of the fundamental reasons why we cling to things is the illusion of control. We often believe that if we hold on tight enough, we can maintain control over the things we care about. Whether it's a desire to control our outcomes at work or in relationships, we think that attachment will give us power over life's uncertainties. However, attachment is born from fear, the fear of loss, the fear of change, and the fear of uncertainty. We want to control the uncontrollable, to make life conform to our desires. But, as the Buddha so wisely taught, attachment is the root of this fear. By attaching to a person, a possession, or an ideal, we set ourselves up for inevitable disappointment. When we try to control what is inherently uncontrollable, we find ourselves in conflict with the nature of existence itself. In the case of powerful leaders like Elon Musk, the CEO of Tesla and SpaceX, his drive for control and perfectionism has led to monumental successes. However, Musk's own attachment to his ambitions and his desire to control every detail of his enterprises have led to significant personal and professional stress. His famously demanding work ethic and his push to control the destiny of humanity through technology come at the cost of his own well-being. Musk himself has spoken about the immense pressure he faces, stating, "I could either watch my companies fail or I could try to do something about it. And I chose to try to do something about it, even if it meant sacrificing my own happiness." This idea of trying to control everything, whether it's a business venture, a relationship, or even one's own reputation, reflects a deep attachment to the outcome. The struggle to control every aspect of life only deepens suffering because, in the end, life itself cannot be controlled. The more we try to manipulate our circumstances, the more we fight against the inevitable flow of change and impermanence. The Buddhist teachings on attachment are not meant to be punitive, rather, they offer a path to freedom. Letting go of attachment does not mean abandoning everything we care about, it means releasing our need for control, our fear of loss, and our clinging to impermanent things. In fact, the more we let go, the more we create space for genuine freedom, peace, and joy. Take the example of the spiritual teacher Thich Nhat Hanh, a Vietnamese Zen Buddhist monk who has influenced millions around the world. Thich Nhat Hanh's teachings emphasize mindfulness, non-attachment, and the importance of living fully in the present moment. One of his most profound insights is that true freedom comes from releasing our attachments, not just to material things but also to thoughts, beliefs, and emotions that limit our potential. In his own life, Thich Nhat Hanh has faced the loss of loved ones and the destruction of his homeland during the Vietnam War. Yet, he has consistently taught that suffering arises when we hold on to the past or the future, rather than embracing the present moment. In his book The Art of Living, Thich Nhat Hanh writes, "Letting go gives us freedom, and freedom is the only condition for happiness." If, in our mind, we are attached to anything at all, we cannot be free. Recent developments in neuroscience have shown how the practice of letting go, releasing attachment, can have a profound impact on our mental health. Research has demonstrated that mindfulness and meditation practices, which are key to Buddhist teachings, can actually rewire the brain. Regular practice helps strengthen areas of the brain associated with emotional regulation, empathy, and decision-making, while reducing activity in areas related to stress and anxiety. For example, a study conducted by Harvard University found that mindfulness meditation, which encourages a non-attached awareness of thoughts and feelings, increases gray matter in the prefrontal cortex, the area of the brain responsible for rational thinking, self-regulation, and perspective-taking. Conversely, it reduces the size of the amygdala, which is associated with fear and emotional reactivity. This suggests that letting go of attachment, through mindfulness and meditation, can have real, measurable effects on our mental and emotional well-being. By training our minds to observe without attachment, we not only reduce our mental and emotional suffering but also cultivate greater peace and clarity. Instead of being controlled by our cravings and desires, we become more attuned to the present moment, free from the constant cycle of longing and disappointment. Attachment, in all its forms, is a significant cause of suffering. Whether it is attachment to people, possessions, beliefs, or outcomes, the act of clinging to impermanent things creates a cycle of dissatisfaction and pain. Yet, through the teachings of the Buddha and the insights of modern neuroscience and psychology, we can begin to understand how to release attachment and find true peace. The process of letting go is not about abandoning everything we love, but about releasing the need to control, the fear of loss, and the illusion of permanence. In doing so, we create space for true happiness, free from the limitations of attachment. Like the wisdom of Thich Nhat Hanh and the example of Steve Jobs, we learn that it is in letting go that we can truly embrace life, in all its impermanence, and find the freedom that lies beyond the clinging. 4. The power of surrender. In the journey of life, one of the most powerful lessons we can learn is the practice of acceptance. While we may live in a world that constantly pushes us toward action, achievement, and striving, Buddhist philosophy invites us to consider a different approach: surrender. This might sound paradoxical. How can surrender, often associated with weakness or passivity, be a source of strength? But in truth, acceptance is one of the most profound forms of spiritual empowerment, offering us peace amidst life's chaos. At its core, acceptance is about embracing the present moment exactly as it is, without resistance or judgment. It is not about passively resigning to life's difficulties, but rather about acknowledging the impermanence of all things and aligning ourselves with the natural flow of existence. The Buddhist teachings on acceptance focus on recognizing the inevitability of suffering, change, and uncertainty, and responding to these truths with grace and equanimity. In Buddhism, the practice of acceptance is not a mere acknowledgement of life's ups and downs, but an active engagement with the truth of impermanence and suffering. This is known as the path of equanimity, the ability to maintain inner peace regardless of external circumstances. It is a form of surrender, not to fate, but to the understanding that we cannot control everything, and that by letting go of our attachments to specific outcomes, we find true freedom. The Buddha's teachings emphasize that life is full of challenges, loss, and change. However, these experiences do not have to lead to suffering. Suffering arises when we resist what is happening, when we push against the natural flow of events. Acceptance, therefore, is not about becoming passive, rather, it is an active participation in life's unfolding, without clinging to any particular outcome. To truly understand the power of acceptance, it is essential to recognize the difference between resignation and surrender. Resignation is a form of giving up, often born out of despair. It is a defeatist attitude that says, "I can't do anything about this, so I'll just let it happen." In contrast, surrender is a conscious decision to let go of resistance, to accept what is without judgment, and to trust that, even in adversity, life has a greater wisdom than we might initially comprehend. From a psychological perspective, acceptance has been shown to have profound benefits for mental health. Cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT, one of the most widely practiced therapeutic methods, includes an element of acceptance, particularly when it comes to difficult thoughts and emotions. Rather than trying to avoid or suppress negative emotions, CBT encourages patients to accept these feelings without judgment, recognizing them as transient states that do not define them. This approach is aligned with the Buddhist practice of mindfulness, being fully present with what is happening right now, without trying to change it. Research in psychology has demonstrated that individuals who are able to accept their emotions, rather than fight against them, are better able to regulate their emotional responses and experience less anxiety and depression. For instance, individuals suffering from anxiety often experience a vicious cycle of worry and fear, which only intensifies their stress. However, those who practice acceptance, allowing themselves to experience their anxiety without judgment, often find that the intensity of the feeling decreases. Instead of fighting against their thoughts, they begin to acknowledge them, which disrupts the cycle of fear and makes the emotions more manageable. In this way, acceptance becomes a powerful tool for cultivating emotional resilience. The practice is not about allowing negative experiences to control us, but about realizing that these experiences are temporary, and that our true power lies in how we respond to them. Neurological research provides further support for the concept of acceptance. Studies on mindfulness meditation have shown that regular practice can lead to structural changes in the brain. In particular, mindfulness has been linked to increased gray matter in areas of the brain associated with emotional regulation, such as the prefrontal cortex. This suggests that the practice of acceptance, by training the brain to embrace the present moment, can help individuals regulate their emotions and respond to stress more effectively. In addition, studies have demonstrated that acceptance can reduce the activity in the amygdala, the brain center for fear and anxiety. When we resist our emotions, the amygdala becomes activated, triggering the fight-or-flight response. However, when we practice acceptance, the brain learns to respond to these emotions with a sense of calm, reducing the impact of stress and fostering a more balanced emotional state. Furthermore, acceptance allows the brain to shift from a state of doing to one of being. In our fast-paced, goal-oriented culture, we are constantly engaged in problem-solving, striving for achievement, and trying to control outcomes. However, this continuous mental activity can lead to burnout, stress, and dissatisfaction. By practicing acceptance, we allow the brain to rest and recalibrate, creating space for creativity, clarity, and deeper insight. One of the most powerful aspects of acceptance is its ability to foster personal growth. In order to grow, we must first accept who we are, where we are, and what we have experienced. Without acceptance, we remain stuck in a cycle of resistance, which prevents us from learning from our experiences and evolving. For example, Nelson Mandela, one of the world's most revered leaders, faced extraordinary hardship during his 27 years of imprisonment in South Africa. During this time, he practiced a deep form of acceptance, not by resigning to his fate, but by embracing the circumstances of his imprisonment as part of his larger journey. Mandela famously said, "I have walked that long road to freedom. I have tried not to falter, I have made missteps along the way. But I have discovered the secret that after climbing a great hill, one only finds that there are many more hills to climb. I have taken a moment here to rest, to steal a view of the glorious vista that surrounds me, to look back on the distance I have come. But I can only rest for a moment, for with freedom comes responsibilities, and I dare not linger, for my long walk is not ended." Mandela's words capture the essence of acceptance, not as resignation, but as the understanding that growth comes through embracing challenges rather than fighting against them. His acceptance of his circumstances allowed him to transform adversity into a tool for inner strength and wisdom. His personal growth became a catalyst for global change, and his journey is a testament to the transformative power of surrender. Acceptance is not limited to extraordinary figures like Nelson Mandela, but is a practice that can be cultivated by anyone, regardless of their circumstances. Take the story of Maya, a woman who experienced the sudden loss of her job during the COVID-19 pandemic. At first, she was overwhelmed by feelings of fear, anger, and frustration. She resisted the situation, constantly replaying what had happened and wishing for things to be different. However, over time, Maya began to practice acceptance. She stopped fighting against the uncertainty and instead focused on what she could control, how she responded to the loss. Through this shift in mindset, Maya discovered a new sense of clarity. She began to see the situation as an opportunity for growth and reflection, allowing herself to explore new career paths, deepen her relationships, and develop a sense of inner peace. Maya's story shows that acceptance does not mean passively enduring hardship, it means actively choosing to be at peace with whatever life brings, knowing that each moment holds the potential for transformation. Ultimately, the power of acceptance lies in the freedom it brings. When we cease resisting life's challenges, we open ourselves to the present moment. This is where true happiness resides, not in the pursuit of external goals or the avoidance of discomfort, but in the deep acceptance of what is. As the Buddha famously said, peace comes from within. Do not seek it without. By embracing the present moment, without judgment or resistance, we align ourselves with the natural flow of life. Through the power of surrender, we release the need to control, and in doing so, we discover the peace and freedom that lies beyond attachment, fear, and suffering. The practice of acceptance teaches us that life is not about controlling outcomes but about surrendering to the unfolding of each moment. In doing so, we find the strength, resilience, and inner peace that allow us to navigate the complexities of life with grace and wisdom. 5. Adversity as a teacher. In every life, there comes a moment, sometimes many moments, when the weight of adversity seems overwhelming. Whether it's the loss of a loved one, a sudden financial setback, or the unexpected collapse of a relationship, we all face hardship in one form or another. In times of struggle, the natural instinct is often to wish things were different, to fight against the pain and discomfort. However, the Buddha's teachings on suffering, dukkha, and the nature of adversity offer a radically different perspective, that adversity is not something to fear or avoid, but rather, it is an essential teacher on the path to wisdom and enlightenment. Buddhism asserts that suffering is an inherent part of existence, it is a universal experience. But rather than viewing adversity as a force of destruction, the Buddha encourages us to see it as a tool for growth. Adversity, when understood and approached mindfully, becomes a source of transformation. The challenges we face have the potential to shape us into more resilient, compassionate, and awakened beings. The key is how we respond to adversity, not the adversity itself. The Buddha's teachings offer profound insights into how to view and engage with suffering. In the Four Noble Truths, he states that suffering is a natural part of life, and it arises from attachment, desire, and ignorance. Adversity, then, is an inevitable result of the impermanent and interconnected nature of existence. But rather than seeing suffering as something to avoid, the Buddha teaches that it is possible to transform our relationship with adversity by cultivating a mindset of acceptance and understanding. In the Dhammapada, the Buddha says, "Pain is certain, suffering is optional." This statement is not meant to suggest that pain itself is avoidable, but that how we perceive and respond to it determines whether it will cause prolonged suffering. The Buddhist teachings urge us to see suffering as an opportunity for personal growth, a way to develop patience, compassion, and wisdom. By confronting adversity with a calm, equanimous mind, we can learn to navigate life's challenges with grace, rather than being overwhelmed by them. Adversity, though difficult and often painful, is a powerful catalyst for personal growth. In fact, some of the greatest minds in history have emphasized the importance of challenges in shaping character. Thomas Edison, for example, faced numerous failures before inventing the light bulb. He famously said, "I have not failed. I've just found 10,000 ways that won't work." Edison's resilience in the face of adversity eventually led him to monumental success. His ability to see failure not as a dead end but as a lesson and a step toward eventual triumph is a powerful illustration of how adversity can be a teacher. In Buddhism, the principle of dukkha, suffering, is seen as an essential part of the human experience. The Buddha teaches that our response to adversity determines whether we will learn from it or become consumed by it. By adopting a mindset of curiosity and openness in the face of difficulties, we can transform our suffering into wisdom. For example, a person who loses a job might initially feel frustration, anger, and fear. However, by examining these emotions and reflecting on the situation, they might uncover hidden opportunities for growth, such as discovering a new career path, developing resilience, or cultivating patience and compassion. This concept is not limited to extraordinary figures like Edison, but can be seen in everyday life. Take, for instance, the story of Sarah, a young woman who faced the traumatic experience of a serious car accident that left her with long-term physical injuries. Sarah's initial reaction was one of despair. The pain, both physical and emotional, seemed insurmountable. But over time, as she practiced mindfulness and acceptance, Sarah began to shift her perspective. Instead of seeing her injury as a permanent setback, she began to view it as an opportunity to learn deeper lessons about herself, about patience, gratitude, and the importance of slowing down. Through her adversity, Sarah found not only healing for her body but a transformation of her heart and mind. Modern psychology and neuroscience offer valuable insights into the concept of resilience, the ability to adapt and grow in the face of adversity. Research has shown that individuals who possess high levels of resilience are able to bounce back from setbacks more quickly and with greater strength. This ability is not something innate, but rather something that can be cultivated through practice and mindset. One of the key factors in building resilience is a mindset of acceptance and non-resistance, which are central to Buddhist philosophy. Studies in the field of positive psychology have shown that individuals who are able to accept difficult emotions, rather than suppress or avoid them, are more likely to cope effectively with stress and adversity. This aligns closely with the Buddhist practice of mindfulness, being fully present with our experiences without judgment. In the face of adversity, mindfulness allows us to acknowledge the pain and discomfort without being overwhelmed by it. Neuroscientific research has further demonstrated that the brain can change in response to adversity. When we face difficult situations, the brain's neural pathways are activated, and new connections are formed in response to these challenges. This is known as neuroplasticity, the brain's ability to reorganize itself based on new experiences. When we face adversity with an open mind and a willingness to learn, the brain strengthens its ability to cope with stress and uncertainty, making us more resilient over time. Adversity can teach us important lessons that would be impossible to learn in times of ease. For example, hardship often teaches us the value of impermanence and detachment. In Buddhist practice, we are encouraged to recognize that everything in life is transient, and that attachment to any one thing, whether it be a material possession, a relationship, or a specific outcome, can lead to suffering. When we experience loss or failure, we are reminded of this fundamental truth. This awareness allows us to let go of our attachments and cultivate a deeper sense of inner peace and contentment. The ancient philosopher Socrates once said, "An unexamined life is not worth living." This idea resonates deeply with the Buddhist perspective on adversity. Difficult experiences compel us to examine our lives more closely, to confront our fears, limitations, and desires. In the process, we learn not only about the external circumstances of our lives but also about our internal landscape. By reflecting on our reactions to adversity, we can uncover deeply ingrained beliefs and habits that may be holding us back. The lessons we learn from hardship can ultimately lead to greater self-awareness, wisdom, and compassion. Take the example of Viktor Frankl, the renowned psychiatrist and Holocaust survivor. Frankl endured unimaginable suffering in Nazi concentration camps, losing his family and facing extreme deprivation. Yet, in his book Man's Search for Meaning, he writes that even in the most horrific circumstances, we always have the freedom to choose our attitude towards suffering. Frankl's ability to find meaning in his suffering allowed him to transcend his circumstances and become a source of inspiration for millions. His story illustrates that, even in the darkest of times, adversity can serve as a teacher, guiding us toward a deeper understanding of ourselves and the world around us. One of the most profound lessons that adversity teaches us is the importance of compassion. When we experience suffering, we begin to understand the pain of others on a deeper level. This understanding fosters empathy, kindness, and a desire to alleviate the suffering of others. The Buddhist practice of karuna, compassion, is rooted in the awareness that all beings experience suffering and that our collective well-being is intertwined. The Dalai Lama often speaks about the importance of compassion in overcoming adversity. He teaches that by cultivating compassion, we can transform our suffering into a source of connection and healing, both for ourselves and for others. In times of personal hardship, we can choose to respond with anger and resentment, or we can choose to respond with compassion, toward ourselves and those around us. This idea is beautifully illustrated in the story of Malala Yousafzai, the Pakistani activist who was shot by the Taliban for advocating girls' education. Despite the physical and emotional pain she endured, Malala responded with an unwavering commitment to her cause. Instead of becoming consumed by anger or hatred, she chose to speak out for the rights of others, demonstrating that even in the face of extreme adversity, compassion and a sense of purpose can lead to profound change. Adversity is not something to be feared or avoided, it is an integral part of life's journey, offering us the chance to cultivate resilience, wisdom, and compassion. The Buddha's teachings remind us that how we respond to adversity, whether with resistance or acceptance, determines whether we will remain stuck in suffering or transcend it to find deeper peace. By embracing adversity as a teacher, we begin to see challenges not as burdens, but as opportunities for growth and transformation. Through mindful acceptance, reflection, and compassion, we can navigate life's inevitable difficulties with greater ease, learning valuable lessons along the way. In doing so, we transform our suffering into wisdom, and our struggles become the very path to liberation. Thank you for staying with us on this enlightening journey through the core principles of Buddhist philosophy. Today, we've explored how to embrace life's impermanence, understand the law of karma, free ourselves from attachment, find strength through acceptance, and transform adversity into our greatest teacher. These aren't just concepts, they're keys to living a more mindful, peaceful, and empowered life. But the journey doesn't end here. The insights shared today are just the beginning of a deeper exploration into the wisdom of the ancient world. So, if you found this video helpful, impactful, or thought-provoking, don't forget to hit that like button, share your thoughts in the comments below, and subscribe to Serenity Path. Together, we can continue to build a community of wisdom and compassion, a space where every step we take is toward greater peace and understanding. Until next time, remember that the path to serenity is never a straight line, but it's always worth the walk. Keep seeking, keep learning, and stay tuned for more.